Hi, I'm Alan Thurston, author of It Ain't So, Shoeless Joe Jackson's Story, which consists of a two-act play and an afterword where I attempt to the best of my ability to make the case for Shoeless Joe Jackson. This is part 4 of my video presentation. When Assistant State's Attorney Hartley Replogle escorted Shoeless Joe Jackson into the grand jury room on September 28, 1920, he told him, "You know you are not the smartest man in the world." To which Jackson replied, "I know it." Joe, however, would have been justified had he shot back, "And you are not the smartest lawyer in the world." His defenders argue that Joe told two different stories to the grand jury, testifying that he was a participant in the plot to fix the 1919 World Series while insisting that he always played to win, was induced by White Sox attorney Alfred Austrian to make a false confession. Gene Carney, the founder of the Society for American Baseball Research Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, wrote, quote, "Testifying before the Cook County grand jury, Jackson told two stories and they contradicted each other, and Replogle failed to ask him to choose one or the other, so both are on the record, giving fuel to those who believe he was in on the fix and to those who believe he was not." William Herzog wrote, quote, "Replogle faced a major contradiction, but he ignored it, because if he pursued it, he risked unearthing Joe's full story." Carney asks, quote, "Why did Joe's grand jury testimony go down as a simple confession instead of the self-contradictory account of a confused witness, describing it as an ambiguous and confused story?" Jackson biographer Donald Kropman contends, quote, "Jackson's grand jury testimony hardly constituted a confession. If there is a more enigmatic and puzzling document in the history of baseball, it is yet to come to light. Jackson told two completely different stories, and nobody ever asked him why." William Lamb writes, quote, "At the core of the Jackson testimony rests a contradiction. On the incriminating side of the ledger, Jackson provided a fairly detailed account of the fix from his perspective, including his acceptance of $5,000 before the start of Game 5. Notwithstanding that, Jackson insisted that he had done nothing in the field to earn his payoff, citing his World Series stats as proof that he had given his best efforts at all time during the action. Alan Dershowitz argues, quote, "Jackson told two diametrically opposed stories, one confessing his guilt and the other protesting his innocence. Logic leads us to believe the first story was probably Comiskey's attorney, Alfred Austrian's, the second, Jackson's," end quote. Shoeless Joe testified that he was first approached in Boston by first baseman Chick Gandil, who offered him $10,000 to frame up something. Joe said no. A few days later, on the bridge leading into the White Sox clubhouse, Gandil increased the offer to $20,000, which Joe also rejected. And Shoeless Joe also told the grand jury that he agreed to be part of the plot. When asked how much he was paid, he said he was, quote, "promised $20,000 and paid $5,000. Jacob Pomranke, the current chairman of the Sabre Black Sox Scandal Research Committee, states, quote, "Joe testified we were promised $20,000 and only received $5,000. Jackson complained under oath that he didn't get all the money he was promised," end quote. Later in his testimony, however, Joe contradicted himself when he was asked by Replogle. Question: "Weren't you very much peeved that you only got $5,000 and you expected to get $20,000? Joe responded, "No." Assistant State's Attorney Replogle made no attempt to clear up this contradiction. At one point, Jackson appeared to be complaining that he did not receive what he was promised, and at another point, he testified that he was not peeved about it. Two stories, one Austrian's, one Jackson's. Hartley Replogle also failed to ask questions that could have exposed the Comiskey cover-up. At one point, the Assistant State's Attorney asked Joe, quote, "Did it ever occur to you to tell the truth about the fix before this?" The baseball star replied that he, quote, "offered to come back last fall I would have told it last fall. I would have told it last fall if they had brought me in, end quote. Shoeless Joe was clearly referring to the exchange of letters he had with White Sox owner Comiskey the previous November, where he offered to return to Chicago to tell what he knew and to clear his name. Instead of asking Joe to explain this startling statement with such obvious questions as, "You offered to come back to Chicago to discuss the corrupt series last fall? To whom did you make the offer?" To which I think Joe would have replied to Comiskey that he was written. They exchanged letters. Then he would have been asked, "You exchanged letters with Comiskey? He never responded to you or to your offer to return to Chicago and tell what you knew about the corrupt World Series?" Instead of asking such obvious questions, Replogle just states, quote, "And you are telling the truth now. You want to tell the truth now, is that it?" End quote. He then changes the subject to a discussion of the individual games. Henry Brigham, the grand jury foreman, Gene Carney writes, quote, "admitted that the grand jury had made no investigations of Comiskey's conduct pertaining to the running down of rumors after the 1919 series. He denied the grand jury ever considered indicting Comiskey," end quote. It is my belief that had the grand jury been aware of the exchange of letters and that Comiskey would not see Shoeless Joe when he came to the White Sox office the day after the series ended, the grand jury may well have investigated Comiskey's conduct and the cover-up would have been exposed. Regarding the individual games, Joe testified, quote, "We went ahead and threw the second game. Jacob Pomeranke argues that since Joe used the pronoun we and not they, that is evidence that he was part of the plot. We threw the games, not they threw the game. I would argue in a false confession, it does not matter what pronouns are used. As an example, one of the most famous false confession cases, the Central Park Five, frequently used the pronoun we. We crossed the street together. We grabbed the jogger, etc. We now know that the exonerated five did not know each other prior to the tragic incident for which they were falsely accused. The fact that they said we is meaningless since they were making a false confession. Joe went 3 for 4 in Game 2 and made no errors. It does not seem that he was trying very hard to throw the game. Interestingly, when Joe was asked during his civil trial in 1924 if the 1917 Chicago White Sox won the pennant, he said yes, they won the pennant, not we won the pennant. Does that mean he did not consider himself to be a member of the team that won not only the pennant, but the 1917 World Series? Referring to Game 3, Pomeranke stated, quote, "I know for a fact that Joe said in 1920 during his grand jury testimony that they were trying to lose Game 3 with Dickie Kerr. They were trying to, quote, kick it. He absolutely said they were trying harder to lose," end quote. Pomeranke states it's a fact that Joe testified before the grand jury that they were trying to lose Game 3. They were trying to kick it. The fact is that Joe did not so testify. Jackson was specifically asked about Game 3 by Hartley Replogle. Question. In the third game, Kerr pitched there 1-0. Did you see anything there that would have led you to believe anyone was trying to throw the game? Joe answered, "No, sir. I think if you would look that record up, I drove in 2 and hit 1. Actually, Joe went 2 for 3 in the game, which the Sox won 3-0, not 1-0. He made no errors. He didn't drive in any runs, but he did score what proved to be the winning run, which was hardly the performance of a ball player who was trying to kick the game." Pomeranke, it appears to me, is not referring to Joe's grand jury testimony, but to an article that appeared in the Chicago Tribune September 29, 1920, the day after the baseball star testified. William Lamb, in his book Black Sox in the Courtroom, and his article An Ever-Changing Story, refers a number of times to, quote, an extended post-grand jury interview, end quote, that Shoeless Joe allegedly gave to the, quote, gathered pressmen, where the slugger reveals that Attempts to dump Game 3 had been frustrated by Dickie Kerr's shutout pitching, end quote. Admitting, quote, the 8 of us did our best to kick it, Lamb writes. This next-day reportage, ignored by Jackson supporters and mostly neglected by scandal chroniclers, has never been discredited, end quote. This, in my opinion, has been ignored and neglected for good reason, simply because it is not credible. That Joe, who just a few hours before had emphatically testified before the grand jury that he had always played to win and had done nothing to throw any game, and who throughout the remainder of his life repeated that sentiment, would say that he tried to kick Game 3 is not believable. There is nothing in the article indicating that Jackson gave an interview to the, quote, gathered pressmen. Lamb, in his book, Black Sox in the Courtroom, notes the article was, quote, initially printed in the Chicago Tribune, September 29, 1920, and then circulated nationwide via the AP wire service, C.E.G., Steubenville, Ohio, Herald Star, September 29, 1920, end quote. As Charles Fountain writes, quote, it is beyond dispute that most newspaper exclusives in those days were scoops, mainly because they were made up. Gene Carney writes, quote, there is also reason to doubt that the words are Joe's. The reports included statements attributed to Jackson, most likely guessing at what he said before the grand jury. None of his statements about not giving his best effort can be found in Jackson's grand jury testimony. Reporters often stole and borrowed from each other, and they were not above embellishing their stories with made-up quotes, end quote. It is my belief, therefore, that the interview was made up by the Chicago Tribune reporter who wrote the article, which was picked up by other newspapers on the AP wire. There is no proof of any such gathering of pressmen. The newspapers were rife with phony quotes, allegedly from Jackson's grand jury testimony, that he had just tapped the ball and deliberately struck out with men in scoring position and had moved slowly to balls that were hit to him. He said none of those things during his grand jury testimony. The newspapers did not print Joe's quotes that he had always played to win and had done nothing to throw any game. William Herzog has observed newspapers published, quote, specious excerpts as if they were Jackson's own words, when in fact they were manufactured by the papers themselves, end quote. Jacob Pomranke himself, in an article about Shoeless Joe, wrote, quote, newspapers in that era were much looser about how they attributed direct quotations, end quote. Yet Lamb refers to the alleged post-grand jury interview. He refers to it often in his writings as proof of Joe's culpability, while never once mentioning in his article an ever-changing story the vitally important exchange of letters between Jackson and Comiskey in November of 1919, where again Joe offered to return to Chicago to tell what he knew and to clear his name. No mention is made of that in his article. Replogle missed another opportunity to expose the Comiskey cover-up when he asked Jackson during his grand jury testimony, quote, when was the last time you saw Gandil and talked to him? Joe replied, quote, it was on the following morning after the series were over, that day in Comiskey's office, waiting in there. Replogle asked him, what did you say to him at that time? Joe responded, I told him there was a hell of a lot of scandal going around from what had happened. He said, to hell with it. He was about half drunk. I went on out and left that night. This testimony definitely should have set off huge alarm bells. A competent interrogator would have asked, Chick Gandil, the ringleader of the fix, was in Comiskey's office the morning after the crooked series ended? Did you ask him why he was there, what he intended to say to Comiskey? Why were you there, Joe? What did you plan to say to Comiskey? Were you summoned or did you go on your own? And instead of asking these very obvious questions, which may well have exposed the Comiskey cover-up, Replogle asked 11 straight questions about the players' drinking habits. Several times during his testimony, Joe insisted that he always played to win. Question: did you make any intentional errors? Answer: no, sir, not during the whole series. Question: did you bat to win? Answer: yes. Question: and run the bases to win? Answer: yes, sir. Question: and field the balls at the outfield to win? Answer: I did. Joe testified he was, quote, sore about the throw he made to home plate in Game 4 that pitcher Seacott tried to intercept. Seacott's misplay allowed the runner to score, and Shoeless Joe was upset about it. If he was part of the plot to throw the series, why was he sore that his co-conspirator botched the play? Replogle did not ask him. He did ask Joe, did you do anything to throw the games? Joe answered, no, sir. Question: any game in the series? Answer: not a one. I didn't have an error or make no misplay. I tried to win all the time. Jacob Pomranke argues, quote, did Jackson play his best or not? It doesn't really matter. He took the money. He was part of the conspiracy. There is no question Joe Jackson was involved in the fixing of the World Series. End quote. David Libicari, as I pointed out in part 1 of my video presentation, wrote, quote, to simply say Joe was guilty because he took the gambler's money given to him by Lefty Williams is a superficial reading of a complex story. End quote. In his charge to the jury at Joe's 1924 civil trial, Judge Gregory stated that whether Jackson took the money is not in dispute. What is in dispute is when he took the money. I would tend to agree with Pomranke that if Shoeless Joe took the money after Game 4, as he testified before the grand jury in September of 1920, an argument can be made that he was part of the conspiracy, no matter how well he performed for the remainder of the World Series. However, I also believe that Joe tried to talk to Comiskey the morning of Game 1 of the World Series, where he asked to be benched, and there is evidence that he did go to Comiskey's hotel room that morning. He also attempted to show Comiskey the bribe money given him by pitcher Lefty Williams the morning after the series ended. Comiskey himself testified under oath that Joe came to his office that morning, waited an hour, and he did not see him. If Joe did not take the money from Lefty Williams until after Game 8, as he testified at his civil trial, and did not know his name was being used by the crooked players, and took the money to Comiskey's office the next day and had the door slammed in his face, I would argue he was not part of the conspiracy. And there is evidence that that is what actually happened. Lefty Williams, like Joe, met with Comiskey's counsel, Alfred Austrian, prior to his testifying before the grand jury on September 29, 1920, the day after Joe testified. I believe Austrian coached Williams to say he gave Joe the bribe after Game 4, before the team went back to Cincinnati for Game 5, so that their stories matched. Williams followed the Austrian script initially, but later in his grand jury testimony, the pitcher changed his story, testifying, quote, after the first 2 games, we were supposed to get our money, but I never got a nickel until the last 2 games were played. That's after Game 7 and 8. If that is true, and I believe it is, Williams could not have given Shoeless Joe the money after Game 4, since he, quote, never got a nickel until after the last 2 games were played. Also, it would not have been after Game 4 that Lefty gave Joe the money, before the White Sox returned to Cincinnati for Game 5, because Game 5 was not played in Cincinnati, it was played in Chicago. Again, Replogle made no attempt to clear up this contradiction. Why did Lefty say he gave Joe the money after Game 4, then later during his testimony change his story, claiming he did not receive a nickel until after the final 2 games? If Replogle had asked this obvious question, why he had initially testified it was after Game 4, Williams, I believe, may well have said that lawyer Austrian suggested he so testify. 2 stories, one Austrian's, one Williams. Gambler Bill Burns swore under oath in his deposition that Lefty Williams told him he was, quote, kind of representing Jackson. Williams also swore under oath in his deposition for Shoeless Joe's 1924 civil trial that Jackson did not give him permission to use his name and did not know his name was being used with the gamblers. Why did Shoeless Joe testify before the grand jury on September 28, 1920, that he received the bribe money after Game 4 of the World Series? William Lamb has written, quote, Joe's misstatements, large and errors small, make no difference to Jackson's admirers, end quote. As a Shoeless Joe supporter, I admit that he does at times make incorrect and or inaccurate statements. He misstates which game Seacott hit the first batter, testifying it was Game 4, not Game 1. He thought he had 18 chances in the outfield during the series when he had 16. He said Dickie Kerr won Game 4 when he actually won Games 3 and 6. He could not remember which game shortstop Swede Risberg botched a double play ball when it was a key play in Game 1. He misstates his performance in Game 3, testifying he drove in 2 and hit 1. He actually went 2 for 3, as I mentioned, and did not drive in any runs. When asked at his civil trial about his 1912 season, he said he hit, quote, about 300, when he hit 395. It is possible Joe misstated that he was given the bribe after Game 4. So it is clear Shoeless Joe, like many people, had some memory problems. It is not believable to me, therefore, that he remembered verbatim all the exchanges that are described in his testimony that he had with fixed ringleader Chick Gandil as he testified before the grand jury, such as, quote, somebody is getting a nice little jab, everybody is crossed, etc. I believe he could have been coached to make such comments by Austrian, and he could also have been coached to say it was Game 4, not Game 8, by the White Sox attorney, I believe. Bill Vack wrote, quote, to a man like Austrian, there is no right or wrong. There are only tactics, stratagems, techniques, and results, end quote. I would not put anything past Austrian, who perhaps suggested Joe say it was Game 4, which would make him part of the conspiracy, and not Game 8, which would mean that he was not part of the plot if Lefty Williams used his name and without his permission, which I believe he did. Judge Gregory, in his charge to the jury at Jackson's civil trial, stated, quote, conspiracy is a combination between two or more persons to do an unlawful act. A mere tacit understanding between co-conspirators to work to a common purpose is all that is essential to a guilty combination. The question is whether Joe Jackson participated in such a conspiracy. It is undisputed that Jackson received $5,000 from a source traceable to those interested in the conspiracy. Whether the money was given to Jackson after the games in the series had all been played, or was given to him after the playing of the games commenced, but before completion of the World Series, is in dispute, end quote. Brilliant lawyer that he is said to have been, I'm sure Austrian was fully aware of what constituted a conspiracy under Illinois law, and could have coached Jackson and Williams to say Joe received the bribe after Game 4, before they returned to Chicago for Game 5, even though Game 5 was actually played in Chicago. So Shoeless Joe would be implicated. They then could control him. The White Sox club could control him, convincing the ball player that he needed their help to stay out of jail. Lefty, however, deviated from Austrian's script, testifying that he received nothing from the gamblers until after the final 2 games of the series. Pomeranke stated on a podcast that, quote, in 1920, Joe just went alone, basically to the grand jury, and kind of told what he knew, and the testimony was, yeah, we did it. We tried to throw the World Series. We were paid off by gamblers, end quote. However, this testimony was after Jackson had spent hours with his adversary's attorney, Austrian, who represented Comiskey's interests, not Joe's. I believe that when Shoeless Joe testified that he was part of the conspiracy, he was following Austrian's script. As I mentioned in part 3 of my presentation, Jackson panicked when he was told by grand jury presiding judge Charles McDonald that he did not believe him when the ball player protested his innocence. McDonald was influenced by the grand jury testimony, I believe, earlier that day of pitcher Eddie Seacott, who claimed Shoeless Joe had attended the initial meeting of the Crooked Players in mid-September 1919 in New York City. However, even Joe's detractors concede that he could not have been at that meeting, since he had not yet been approached about joining the conspiracy. I believe Austrian told Joe that no judge or jury would believe him if he testified that he was innocent, even if it was the truth. Seacott had implicated him, and he had taken the gambler's money, put it in the bank, and made withdrawals. Joe may have protested that he took the money to Comiskey the day after the 1919 World Series ended and had the door slammed in his face. He had also written a letter in November, as I've mentioned previously, a mere month after the World Series ended, offering to return to Chicago to tell what he knew, and Comiskey failed to respond to his letter. I believe Jackson was told that if he insisted he was innocent, he could be indicted for perjury and would go to jail. If he confessed, then the team would protect him, see that he would not be indicted and would therefore not go to jail. But he must not implicate Comiskey. If the White Sox owner was implicated, they would not be able to help him. Also, if he testified he was innocent, he would likely incur the wrath of the violent gamblers who would believe he took their money under false pretenses, putting himself and his wife Katie at risk. I also think Shoeless Joe was coached to corroborate much of what appeared in the Maharg interview that was on page 1 of the Chicago Tribune the day Joe went and met with Sox attorney Austrian, and the first page article that appeared in the Tribune 3 days earlier on September 25th, 1920. He should describe Abe Attell and Bill Burns as the gamblers who were involved, as the newspaper articles indicated. He should describe Chick Gandil and not Eddie Seacott, whom the gambler Billy Maharg implicated, as being the ringleader of the fix. Comiskey, I believe, was hoping that Seacott and others of the Black Sox players would at worst be suspended and not banned from organized baseball for life, and could at some point return to his team. He didn't care about Gandil, who had retired after the 1919 season. I think he had no desire to bring Gandil back. So Shoeless Joe testified that he joined the conspiracy and was part of the plot to throw the World Series. When he was asked by Assistant State's Attorney Rapalgo about a meeting held at the Warner Hotel in Chicago a few days before the start of the 1919 World Series between gamblers and the crooked White Sox players, Joe stated that he was told by both Lefty Williams and Chick Gandil that gamblers Abe Attell and Sleepy Bill Burns were present at the meeting. However, during what I feel was one of the most significant sections of his testimony, Shoeless Joe testified that he was approached by Bill Burns in the lobby of the Sinton Hotel in Cincinnati on the morning of Game 1. Joe said the gambler, quote, told me about this stuff and I didn't know so much. I hadn't been around and I didn't know so much. Burns asked, where is Chick? I said, I don't know. He walked away from me, end quote. Clearly going to look for Gandil, who without a doubt had assured the gambler that the best hitter on the team was in on the plot. Joe continued, quote, I didn't know enough to talk to him about what they had planned. I wouldn't know it if I had not seen him, end quote. How could Joe, who testified he had agreed to be part of the plot, who said he was told by both Williams and Gandil that gamblers Attell and Burns had met with the Black Sox players at the Warner Hotel a few days before the World Series started, not know what Burns was talking about when he asked Jackson about the plot? Shoeless Joe even said that he would not have known about the plot had he not seen Burns that morning. Again, two stories, one Austrian's with Joe confessing that he was part of the plot, the second Jackson's that he didn't even know what they were plotting. Two stories. State's Attorney Rapalgo made no attempt to clear up the contradiction. Donald Grobman, Joe's biographer, writes, quote, Rapalgo's line of questioning is most interesting for the questions he did not ask. Joe's account of his chance meeting with Burns was an opportunity to follow up and perhaps uncover more about the fix, but Rapalgo did not want Joe to tell what he did as a result of this meeting, namely, tell Comiskey. so the subject was immediately dropped, end quote. Joe's supporters believe he went to Comiskey's room at the Sinton Hotel after the encounter with Burns and asked to be suspended from the series. I believe that if Replogle had asked Jackson why he said he would be part of the plot and not know what they were plotting, the ball player may well have said lawyer Austrian suggested he so testify that he was part of the plot. As Joe testified during his 1924 civil trial, that Austrian suggested he say he was ashamed of himself during his 1920 grand jury testimony, which to me is definite evidence that he was coached by Austrian. Ironically, Burns and Attell did not attend the Warner Hotel meeting, according to Lefty Williams, who testified before the grand jury on September 29, 1920. The Southpaw claimed the gamblers present at the meeting were Sport Sullivan and Brown, a.k.a. Nat Evans, who was a lieutenant of Arnold Rothstein. Austrian did not know Williams would so testify when he met with Joe Jackson the day before, so he advised Shoeless Joe, I believe, to name Attell and Burns, who were mentioned so prominently in the Chicago Tribune articles, dated September 25th and the 28th. As the attendees at the meeting. Joe testified before the grand jury, quote, Attell was to give $100,000. It was to be split up $15,000 a day or something like that after each game, end quote. All of this was described in the Chicago Tribune articles, and so Joe could easily have been coached to so testify about the plan to distribute the money. And the subsequent double cross by Abe Attell of the Black Sox players. Joe was asked about the planned distribution after each game. Question, that is to Gandil? Answer, yes. Again, I believe he was coached to put all of the blame on Gandil and not on Seacott. Was Replogle such a terrible interrogator, or was there something more sinister at work? Charles Comiskey, his attorney Alfred Austrian, and presiding grand jury judge Charles McDonald were powerful men who testified during Shoeless Joe's civil trial that they had been cronies for decades. It seems very likely to me that these comrades conspired with Replogle to prevent the exposure of the Comiskey cover-up. Whenever Joe was on the verge of exposing the cover-up, Replogle would steer him in another direction, shifting to a new topic to prevent him from providing American League President Van Johnson, who was a mortal enemy of Comiskey, with all the material he would need to destroy the White Sox owner. Robert Cannon, son of Jackson's attorney Raymond Cannon at the 1924 civil trial, saved the civil trial transcripts from being destroyed in the 1950s. Raymond Cannon's grandson, Thomas, wrote, quote, the testimony before the grand jury in 1920, there was no cross-examination. The witnesses came in. They were questioned by Assistant State's Attorney Replogle, but there's no cross-examination. And because those witnesses weren't actually represented by counsel acting in their own interests, you don't really get the flavor. The whole thing was very trustworthy, end quote. Cross-examination is not permitted in grand juries. Had it been allowed, and if Joe had been questioned by an attorney representing his interests, Jackson would have testified, I believe, about his request to be suspended before Game 1, about his going to Comiskey's office to show him the bribe money, and about having the door slammed in his face, and about his exchange of letters with the White Sox owner, where he offered to return to Chicago to tell what he knew and to clear his name. This would have cleared up the ambiguities and contradictions and confusions that were the result of his interrogation by Hartley Replogle, and the Comiskey cover-up would have been exposed. As Gene Carney wrote, quote, what exonerated Shoeless Joe condemned Comiskey, end quote. In short, it would be Shoeless Joe Jackson who would currently be in the Hall of Fame, and not Charles Comiskey. And part 4. In my next video presentation, I will examine Shoeless Joe's 1924 civil trial.